And it talks about the necessity, really, of us to monitor ourselves, to inspect ourselves and make sure that we aren't slipping away. And it's driven by something that happened to me. And so sometimes Christians don't inspect themselves as they must. And the Bible does actually say that in a number of different ways, that you need to keep inspecting yourself. And the reason is that the world is all around us, and all of its influences are always impinging on us and trying to get us to be like the world. And if you don't do that inspection, you don't see that you've become the same as the world, and you drift away and become just like the world. And nobody can tell the difference between you and the world. And and so some churches and some Christians have gotten used to doing things in a certain way, and they're happy with that, and they like that way. And they nobody ever asks them, nobody ever says, is this really biblical what we're doing, or is this something that the world does that we're copying? And so they don't do that comparison, they don't do that inspection, and they don't say, is this really biblical, and is it something that we should stop doing? Or sometimes they do look. I've seen some churches that have looked at things and said, well, this is kind of not really biblical, but we're going to do it anyway because we like it, and we think we can justify it by saying that we do this and this. And so they find ways to justify what they're doing instead of stopping what they're doing. And and it can be such an insidious thing. It can sneak into the church so easily. And so people just start doing it without really thinking about it, and nobody puts the thought in when it's coming in, and it gets established. And once it's established, it's really hard to get it out of the church. You'll start offending people if you start throwing out some of the things that the churches do for practices. And it's not just bad practices, it's bad beliefs and bad thinking, ways of thinking about things, ways of understanding society, ways of understanding life. Those bad thoughts come from the world, and bad sayings. The world has lots of bad sayings that we can pick up and start using and not realizing the depths of what that really means, and that it's not really a biblical saying at all. And all of these things, these bad practices, can interfere with our own personal growth. And it does. And I know that to be a fact. I've seen that. And so sometimes when God wants you to grow, he has to get rid of these bad things before he can move you to the next thing, because the next thing is going to conflict with the bad thing that you believe or do or whatever it is where God wants to move you to. And so if we've got this death grip on the bad thing and we love it so much, we're just not going to give it up, and they're going to have to pry it from our dead cold hands. We're never going to be able to move on because it's in the way for what God wants to do, and you're not going to give it up, and so you can never be moved on any further. And this was really my experience. When I came back to the church, back to the faith, I joined a Protestant church, and at first I didn't. I thought that was fine, but over a period of time, God began to show me things, and I was willing to say, "Oh, this is a problem," and drop it, and stop doing these things, and stop believing these things, and so over a series of steps, I was able to grow because I was willing to let go of these things when God showed me, "Hey, this is not really biblical." And I was always monitoring. I was really conscious of what the Bible said, and comparing what the Bible said to the way I lived and the way others lived. And I think that's a necessary, well, it is a necessary thing for all of us to be always doing that monitoring. And so my experience bears that out, that there were a lot of things in Protestantism that I had to drop off as I learned that they weren't biblical at all. And so what caused all of this to happen, and this message to come about, was a celebration of life that I attended remotely, and that was last weekend. And at this celebration of life, the person who had died had been dead for 8 weeks. I don't know if that's a new thing or what, but it seems like a long time to me. Normally, those sorts of things happen very quickly after the death. But in this case, it had been 8 weeks since the person had died that they were holding this celebration of life. I've been at another celebration of life also, where it was a long period of time after the person died. So maybe that's the new thing. I don't know. But in any case, the deceased had been dead for a long time, and people should have been able to adapt the crushing blow of when the person dies. And this was a person who was in the prime of their life, and so it was an unexpected death. And so the shock of that after 8 weeks should kind of go away and be more muted, but it's going to last for a long time. If you know my story, I've told you before that my brother died on his 18th birthday when I was 20, and that shock, I understand that shock, and it takes a while to even sort of be able to function for a while. and it took me a year till I really felt that I was back to normal. But after a couple months, you really should be functional again. And so the attendees at this celebration of life, which was held at a church, were almost exclusively Christian people. And what they did there was they shared some stories. They had people come up to the podium and share some stories about him and some things like that. But what I noticed was that people were crying all the time. And I said, wow, this is sure some celebration with people crying all the time. That's not my idea of a celebration. It's more like the old style funerals. And so what popped into my mind was a verse from the Bible, and this comes from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13. And Paul is speaking here, and he says, I want you to know, my brethren, that you should not have sorrow because of those who are asleep, as do the rest of mankind, who have no hope. So what he's saying there is you shouldn't be sorrowing like they sorrow, because you have a different hope than they do. And the direct translation says, "Not you should be sorrowing to you." So it's not sorrowing for the person who has died. It's sorrowing to yourself. And so Paul is really saying that's not how you should conduct yourself when someone dies, when a brother or sister dies. And a very similar thing is said here in the NIV version of that verse, and it says, "Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope." So he says, right there in the NIV translation, it's even clearer, I think. He says, you should not grieve like the rest of the world grieves. Your grieving shouldn't be like that. And the reason for that, he says, is because we have a hope and where they have no hope. And so I thought this grieving of theirs seemed kind of out of place, but it's something that you see an awful lot in churches. And so I was wondering about this, and then one of the speakers actually read that very verse. As he read that, I thought, wow, well, maybe he's going to say something good here about this. But no, what he said in summarizing that verse that he read, we have this hope that we will see him again in heaven. Oh, man, that's wrong in a couple ways. So he missed what the verse was saying. The point of the verse that Paul has written is that you shouldn't be grieving like the world grieves, because you know you're going to see this person again, but you're not going to see them in heaven again because he didn't go to heaven. So they missed what the point of the verse was, and the point of the verse was about the way Christians should be mourning or grieving, and he misunderstood what the hope is. And this is a standard Protestant belief. Their hope is that they're going to die and go to heaven. But the hope in the New Testament that is talked about by Paul many times and by others as well is the second coming, the return of Jesus. And they don't have that hope. Their hope is that they're going to see somebody again in heaven. And so their expectation is that they're going to die and so on. They certainly believe in a second coming. They just don't believe they're going to be around to see it. They believe that they're going to die and see people in heaven again. And so some bad teachings in there. So we've got some bad practices, we've got some bad teachings, and they're not really looking at themselves or what the Bible really says. Now, I want to clarify something here. The words mourning and sorrow and grief. Mourning is not the same as sorrow, and I had to actually clarify that for my own needs. Mourning, here's a quote that I found I thought was pretty good. Mourning is a process. Practices observed vary depending on the society, religion, or community in which it takes place. So mourning is the process of getting used to the loss, and societies have different ways of doing that. And we really don't have a lot of practices associated with mourning that are standard practices in our society. But there are other societies where there's a whole bunch of things that you do and periods of time when you do them. And we don't have much of that for a mourning process. And this quote continues on, and it says, sorrow is an internal emotional state characterized by feelings of sadness, powerlessness, and loss. And so that's different from mourning. Mourning is a process that you go through to get used to the loss. Sorrow is the feelings of loss and sadness. And so Paul is talking about mourning without sorrowing. He used the word sorrow, not mourning. He doesn't say we shouldn't mourn. He says we shouldn't sorrow like the world sorrows. And that's what I was seeing here at this celebration of life, is that people were still sorrowing. And after such a period of time, it seemed odd that they would do that. Um, and in addition to that, I looked around. I said, well, in what other ways are these people really no different from the world? And one thing that I noticed there is while I was waiting for the church's online presentation to begin, I did this online because it's often a different country, and and then after the service, I also listened to what was going on this presentation. This is their online service, and in both cases, before and after the service, that church played secular music as background music while you waited, and the secular music that I listened to described ideas that were opposed to the Bible. And I was shocked to hear secular music being played here at a church as the background music while you wait. And so that kind of shocked me as well. And another thing that I saw is the various women got up to talk about this person, and I saw that they were dressed like women of the world. You couldn't tell any difference between the way they were dressed and the way the women of the world would dress at such an event. So we see a number of things where people are dressing like the world, living like the world, talking like the world, and we're also seeing bad teachings that are in there. And you can't, they're stuck. These bad teachings have resulted in them being kind of stuck in this position. So what was said about him, that other bad teachings that were in there is, and I believe this was the pastor of the church speaking. I don't know him, but I think that was him speaking. He said that when the deceased died, he was immediately translated into the presence of Jesus. There is no biblical foundation for that idea. It just isn't there. Nonetheless, that is standard Protestant belief. And then another speaker said that heaven has gates, and so this person had now gone in through the gates of heaven. Well, no, that's not true either. The Bible talks about gates, but not on heaven. It talks about gates on the city that will be on the earth after the millennial time, so much later in the future. And so, because of these bad teachings, these people cannot grow. God can't get them to let go of these things. And some people do escape out of that church, but most don't. Most people get stuck in their church, and they believe what their church. And each person kind of slowly grows, or at whatever rate they grow, and they grow to the highest level that the church can teach, and they stagnate there. They can't go any further than that. They can't exceed their teacher because they're not willing to let go of what the church is teaching, because some of what the church is teaching is not right. And so some of them have a desire for more, and they're not happy in the church, and they go searching for that sometimes. And when they go searching for that, sometimes they bring in stuff from the outside world that doesn't belong in the church, and that causes the church to drift. Or sometimes they drift away from the church into another church, hoping that it will be different and better, but they still don't find that thing. So God is giving them this desire to grow, but they're kind of stuck because they're stuck in the beliefs that they have. And a few people that were up there speaking said that they had been angry with God at first. And that's a real sign of spiritual immaturity, is that we should all understand that this happens. This is the fate of everyone. We're all going to die, and we don't know when. It could be a short time from now. It could be in the future. And it's not something that God has done that we should be angry with him. And so it's a sign of immaturity to be angry with God over the death of someone, even if it was an unexpected death. And and the question comes to mind: if you really trust in God, how can you be angry with Him? And so, if you really trust in Him, and someone close to you dies, someone you liked a lot, you shouldn't be angry with Him, because if you trust in Him, you know that this God is involved in all of this. It didn't happen without Him being involved, and it's all in God's hands. And especially knowing that you have this hope that they have everlasting life as you will. And so, if you really trust in God, you shouldn't ever be angry with Him. So that's all I wanted to say on that topic. There are Christians and there are churches who are very much like the world, and are unable to move away from that. They're kind of stuck in what they are and what they believe, and and that's just the way it is for them. And for ourselves, the message is we need to inspect ourselves always to make sure that we aren't bringing into ourselves ideas from the world in which we live, because those ideas are sometimes very catchy ideas, very trendy ideas, and it's easy for us to fall into them.
Hey, Stan, I just want to make a quick comment on that. When you started the presentation and, you gave your testimony on how you were noticing, feeling uncomfortable in certain situations or things that were said or done. And mine would be, when I did finally was brought into um, part of worship and, started attending and started actually reading the Bible. Um, I felt the same way. I was reading the Bible. I was discovering the Word. And I felt uncomfortable because at that time I was living with my parents and I had my son, and I was going to Heart of Worship, and I was like, okay, this is the truth. I knew it was the truth, but one year we still celebrated Halloween. And so he was dressed like in Winnie the Pooh, it wasn't anything,
Yeah.
but it was, but inside me, it's like, no, this doesn't feel right. You're not supposed to do this, and it was like, I was brand new, but I was to the church, but I was reading, I was discovering, I was trying to understand it. And it's like a little voice, a little feeling. So it's not right.
Yeah.
What you're doing is not right. Don't teach your son this. Don't allow him to go down that path. You need to stop. And so we did. I did. And it was a big, horrible thing. I was, according to my mom, joining a cult, but, yeah, the cult of the truth. Um, but yeah, so it was difficult going through that, uncomfortable, especially when you're living with the person or with the people. They can't understand it, but you feel it, that it's the truth, that you should not be of the world or be like the world. And that's very hard for them to understand.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah. Yeah, and all those words you said were really good. And I'll add something more to that. A lot of these people here, obviously, I knew. I didn't know the actual deceased, but I knew his father and other people. Um, and I know that these people are Bible reading people, and so that's part of my, I guess, surprise here. Although I know I'm not surprised because I knew it would be this way. But despite the fact that they do indeed read the Bible, it seems that they kind of gloss over parts of it that don't line up, or they can't explain why they don't do those things or believe those things. And that, like you said, it just kind of grabs you and says, this isn't right. How can they be doing this? Nonetheless, they do.
Yeah, I mean that's like Bible based that aren't Bible based, and churches that celebrate holidays that shouldn't be celebrated. I mean, where I work at Catholic Charities, and I always think of it that I give the Catholic Church just an initial pass, because without the early Catholic Church, Christianity probably wouldn't be the predominant religion in the world. Just like I always give France a pass, because without France, our country might not exist, or it might have been 50 or 100 years later that we existed. But boy, those teachings that we're writing down, the big thing is, and they're always about charity and giving, which is good. But now it's like they're coming out. They want people to donate Halloween costumes to families and little kids that can't afford Halloween costumes. And they've actually put that in the newspaper. Catholic Charities is seeking donations of new or slightly used Halloween costumes for small children. And we have every year, they call it Pumpkin Palooza, where we go to this big church and all the kids come by and drive by in a car, and they're in costumes, and the employees of Catholic Charities hand out candy, and they're dressed in costumes. And fortunately for everything that they do, they absolutely understand other people that are other faiths, because I told them the first time I started to work there in the middle of October, and when they said, okay, everybody has to go, I just went to our leader of our ride work, and I said, look, I'm a Christian, but I do not celebrate Halloween. I just want you to know that. And she said, okay, you don't have to go. And they've never said anything else about it. But that's so bizarre that a Christian church, or somebody that claims to be Christian, would say, hey, we want to dress kids up in Halloween costumes so they can celebrate Halloween. That sounds so bizarre.
Yeah. I agree completely. And you made a good point there about the Catholic Church and their contributions to Christianity. Yes, they definitely were the church that carried Christianity through to the world over like 1500 years. They did a terrible job of it, but they did carry it through. And so now here we are with some religions that are closer to what the Bible says, but yeah, they did have a contribution. It's not always a bad thing. God works through all sorts of ways.
Yeah, so they were I mean, they carried it at the beginning, and then unfortunately they turned away and became not so great. Just like France became not so great. You
Yeah,
can't deny the early contributions, but at some point it's like,